Welcome to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. In this series, we have gone over the influences of culture. In this section, we're going over the influences of worldview. We're basing this series on a quote from Stephen Jay Gould. Stephen Jay Gould observed and said, "First facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people. Theory, habit, prejudice, and culture all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them." Again, this was a quote that I was very interested in because I wanted to understand how academic people differed on their opinions on how to interpret things. In the area of origins, how there can be 6 different scientific models of origins, and that they aren't really in agreement, but yet they're all supported by different scientists and people of high academic standing. So how can I, not understanding or not being a scientist, how could I discern what was truth and who had the truth and what was true behind those models? But then after reading Stephen Jay Gould and understanding or seeing his quote about science, he was a paleontologist and a biologist. He said, "Theory, habit, prejudice, and culture all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them, the way in which we observe them, and how our perception and observation process is influenced by those 4 factors." What we've covered is in the first series of lectures on culture, and how culture actually gives us and forms us an attitude or a perspective, a standpoint of how we think and what we might even think. And then we have gone on into worldview, and in the last lecture we touched on worldview and theory. Why did we bring theory in? Well, theory is one of the 4 factors that Stephen Jay Gould lists. And so then I had found another quote by Richard Dawkins, and he said again, "I want to persuade the reader not just that the Darwinian worldview is true, happens to be true, but that it is the only known theory that could in principle solve the mystery of our existence." So he equated worldview and theory, that they were similar items. So we looked at theory, and theory does have a historical base of coming from the Greek language of meaning to view, to look at. It means how to look at something through a grid of rules and principles and methods already preset on how you're going to organize, how you're going to understand what you're looking at. When we look at something, we have to have a grid to be able to understand what we're looking at, to put it in. And that grid can become very disturbed or unsettling when, as we went to another culture, my grid didn't work. I didn't understand anymore what was going on because it did not fit until I understood more the grid that they were using. And then I was able to understand what they did and anticipate what they were going to do because of understanding the grid or the framework, the theoretical, I guess, framework from which they were coming from. So Richard Dawkins, he mentioned worldview happens to be true, but there is only the known theory. So he answers theory. The part that was Stephen Jay Gould, he said, theory, habit, prejudice, and culture. So now Richard Dawkins now gives me theory. What is theory? And theory is a way of looking at something. Theory is based on spectator, on the word spectator, it comes from the same etymology. And so it's kind of like theory is not versus fact, but theory can be a way of looking at something. It's a theory on, but it's guided by a grid work, by something that is giving me how to understand what I am looking at. So we went over theory in the previous lecture. Now we're going to go over worldview. I thought I kind of understood worldview a bit, but actually after a while, after living in Bolivia, I just really felt worldview is lacking something, because from what I understood, worldview was about content. It was about belief system. But when I went to Bolivia, I understood that Bolivians have a different view of things. And it wasn't content, it was the way they viewed things. It was different. And so my question was, how do I integrate culture and different people groups into the concept of worldview? Where does all this stand? And so that's what started this next section. What we're just going to quickly go over is that worldview is actually a literal translation of how one views the world. And it comes from German. It's and the German term from which we get worldview is Welt. And I hyphenated there because those are two words that were combined to form one concept. And so separating the two words gives me a little bit of a handle on how to put it together. And I guess I haven't taken German, but the W is like a V, so it'd be Welt. Weltanschauung. And so what does that mean? Well, Welt means world, and Anschauung means to view. So Anschauung is very similar to what we had seen in the previous lecture on theory. So Anschauung and theory are both concepts of viewing, to view something. And in this concept, the view is of the world. And that is Weltanschauung, which is worldview. So what is worldview? Where does that come in? Well, this is now another facet that I was actually glad to find, and that I hadn't heard a lot of this. But worldview, or the Weltanschauung, is one of three concepts that were developed by the Germans at a certain time in history when there was a growing influence of globalization. It was the Enlightenment period from the French that was globalizing all thought patterns. And so the Germans felt that their culture was being threatened, that their identity, national identity, was being threatened by this movement. So they started developing this three Welt concept. And the first Welt concept is the Weltbild. And what does that mean? Well, Welt, or Welt, means world, and Bild means picture. And so they start with the world picture, is that through our culture, through our experiences, through our learning process, we develop a picture of the world, like a transparency. And it is this picture that has influence on me. These influences shape who I am. These influences shape how I think and how I will look at things. So the Weltbild is the ground force, is the the culture, the environment, the genetics, everything that goes into influencing how I see things. And that even includes principles and rules and basic beliefs. So all of that is built into a concept of what they called Welt or Weltbild. Now, interesting in that there was another German philosopher later on, much later, his name Hans Gadamer, or however it is said, Gadamer. He came up with that this first phase of influences upon me as a thinker, me as a person that's forming me individually, gives me a way of looking at the world, a way of judging the world. And so this first phase, he calls, is prejudgment. Prejudgment in a way that before I can judge, I have to have a certain grid to judge by. That's what he called prejudices, our prejudices. But not in a negative term of being prejudiced against something, but in a positive way of saying that these are my prejudging notions, my prejudging grid, my prejudging framework, and it includes all of the influences of my surrounding, my culture, my family, my schooling. It includes everything. So Weltbild produces prejudices, which is part of Stephen Jay Gould's, which is the 4 factors: the theory, habit, prejudice, and culture. So now we have culture, we have theory, and now we have prejudices. And so the first phase of the Weltbild is the formation subconsciously and consciously, but it's the formation of the framework, of the grid, of the picture, building a picture of the world. Then from that picture of the world, we go to the Weltanschauung, which is viewing the world through that picture. So now it's starting to make sense to me, is that yes, a worldview is the act of viewing the world through the picture of the world. So the Weltbild is the forming of our picture. It's our culture. It's all these influences that come down upon us, and then we look out on the world through that influence. And that is a worldview, the Weltanschauung, which was originally the concept of the German model. Now what we have here is first the subject, me, is being influenced by everything around me. And that is the Weltbild. But the moment then that I take those influences, consciously or not, then I start looking out at the world through that frame. Then it shifts from a Weltbild to a Weltanschauung, to a worldview. I'm actively now viewing the world around me through that frame. That is worldview. That is why Richard Dawkins equated worldview with the theory, because they're both viewing. But what theory does not give us is the previous step of putting together that whole framework of how we're viewing and how we are to understand what we're viewing. So that is Weltanschauung, worldview. But there was a third Welt, or Welt, which is number 3, which is the Welt model. And what that is about is it's the subject, me, now generating a model of the world based on my view of the world, based on my picture of the world. So a Welt model would be a scientific model of origins, one of the six. And so that is where we come from with different models of the world, is through our view of the world, which is based on our picture of the world. I think now I'm getting more of a handle on worldview and how worldview incorporates a Bolivian way of seeing the world, or Peruvian, or Guatemalan, or whatever, whoever, is that it's built from Welt built is the picture of the world. So now let's get an official definition of today. What is a worldview? So what we have today, a worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. By James Sire, The Universe Next Door. So a worldview is a commitment. Okay, it is. It is a fundamental orientation of the heart, and I would say of the mind, about the basic constitution of reality. Very true. We have to come in with a grid to understand what reality is about. We come in with a preset set of rules and regulations and principles that's going to guide about reality, that provides the foundation on which we live, move. It's not exactly the foundation. There's a couple layers under that, but it is hooked to the foundation, and all of these processes have to be hooked to a foundation. They aren't just thinking out there on their own with no foundation. They're all hooked to the foundation, and the foundation sits on the culture, the influences, the Weltbild, which would be under the foundation. It would be the way of thinking. So that is worldview. What I've developed is a house of thinking, and it's a house that we're going to be using for the rest of the series. And it might at first look a little complicated, and you might not even be able to see the whole thing because the letters are too small. But it's a house that goes in progression of adding things up, of showing where the Weltbild fits in, and how the Weltanschauung comes out of that, and how the Welt model then shows on that. So what we have is the ground level, zero ground. And that is zero is the Weltbild. It's the influences of the ground forces. It's the influences of our surrounding. It's the influences of all the influences that come upon us, all the factors. So that they're based our house on those influences, then we have to choose in the foundation our source of knowledge. Where do you get a source of knowledge from? And we're going to go over that in the next phases, in the next lectures. Source of knowledge. We have to pick and choose a source of knowledge. Based on that source of knowledge, then we mine out our basic belief system. We get basic beliefs, and that forms a system of thought. Then on that system of thought, we have to have methods to be able to implement that system of thought. And then we get to a system of practice. And then on that system of practice, we have resources that are available to implement, to be able to understand how all this works. Okay, we'll get there. And then that produces an area of values and ethics, which is the conclusion of our house. So our house, what we have is from the top to the bottom, we have the Weltbild, which is on the bottom section, corresponds to the under the ground level, and includes the foundation up to the first floor. The Welt build is the putting together of all the principles, the rules, the beliefs, and it's forming our whole grid, our whole picture of how to understand the world. Then from that system of thought is Welt and Chang, the worldview. We're actually now viewing the world through that grid. And that worldview then comes up, and based on the rules and everything below it, then looks out and it systemizes the world. It identifies the world. It then makes a model of how to function in the world and what the world looks like through the model of Welt model. So that is where we're going, worldview. Not just world view, but world picture, world view, and then world model. Back to Stephen Jay Gould, where he says, first facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people, but now we have theory. We don't have habit yet, but maybe it's coming. We have prejudice, and we have culture. How they all influence the way we see things. And I thank this person for his honesty, being a scientist, and saying that we all don't see things the same way, even being scientists. But there is theory, there's habit, there's prejudice, there's culture that all comes in to factor into how I see things. At least that's the way I see it. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. If you'd like to communicate with us, we're available at doubleroadrover.com or directly at email, thn.academia@gmail.com. Thank you again.